Good morning. I'm David Reese, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual meeting of the board. This is the fifth meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2020, and on or before September 30th, 2021. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Christina DeRose.
Present.
Shayla Garcia. Not present. Cristian Gonzalez Rivera.
Present.
Leah Goodridge.
Present.
Cecilia Hossa.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Patty Stone.
Present.
Scott Walsh.
Present.
David Reese present. The next meeting of the board will be a public hearing. 2 virtual public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines will be held on the following dates and times. Wednesday, June 10th, 2020, there will be a virtual Zoom public hearing from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m., which the public can view the meeting via YouTube feed and listen via telephone. On Thursday, June 11th, 2020, there will be another virtual Zoom public hearing from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. The public can view this meeting via YouTube feed and listen via telephone. If you want to comment on the proposed rule at our virtual public hearings, you can sign up to speak. Please note that we have a limited number of slots for registration. If there is time at the end of each hearing, after all those who have registered have been heard, we will hear from other attendees at each virtual hearing. Registration to speak will begin June 1st, 2020. You can register online through our website, nyc.gov/RGB, by email at csuperville, that's CSUPERVILLE, at nycrgb.org, or by calling 212-669-7480 from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. In addition, you can now submit written, audio, and video comments prior to the hearings for the board members' review. Instructions to submit these comments are available on the board's website at nyc.gov/RGB, by email at ask@nycrgb.org, or by calling the RGB at 212-669-7480. The final vote will take place on June 17th, starting at 7 p.m. Today, staff will present 2020 Housing Supply Report and changes to the rent-stabilized housing stock in NYC in 2019. Both of these reports have been posted on our website and are available to the public, as well as the slides from the staff presentations. Just click Research on our homepage to download these documents. After the presentation of the RGB reports, HPD Assistant Commissioner Lucy Joffe will be making a presentation to the board members. I will now introduce Danielle, who will be presenting the 2020 Housing Supply Report.
Good morning.
Good morning.
If you give me 1 second to share my screen. Everyone can see the screen, right?
Yep.
The Rent Stabilization Law requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider the overall supply of housing accommodations and overall vacancy rates. Therefore, our research staff produces an annual housing supply report, which highlights year-to-year changes and trends in the supply of residential housing in New York City, with a focus on findings from the 2017 Housing and Vacancy Survey, new construction and demolition data, conversions and subdivisions, cooperative and condominium activity, housing rehabilitation, and government housing programs and funding. I would like to start with a special note. While published in May 2020, due to constraints in gathering current data, this report focuses almost exclusively on data from 2019. Future editions of this report will better reflect the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on housing supply. The major findings of this year's housing supply report are 26,547 building permits were issued in 2019 for housing units, an increase of 27%. In the first quarter of 2020, permits fell by 10.8%, and the most recently available data from April of 2020 shows that permits fell by 75.6% as compared to the same month of the prior year. The number of new housing units completed in 2019 fell to 26,599, a 6.9% decrease over the prior year. City-sponsored efforts during 2019 will add or preserve 25,889 housing units to the residential stock, 61% of which are preservation projects. This is a decrease in total units of 24.3% over the prior year. Demolitions increased 0.3% to 1,894 in 2019. And there was a 22.6% increase in the number of residential units in co-op or condo plans approved in 2019 to 6,583 units, while the number of approved plans fell by 2.1%. The number of units constructed with 421A certificates decreased by 19.6% to 22,754. The number of units newly receiving J51 abatements or exemptions decreased by 54.8% to 13,487. Certificates of no harassment issued to permit SRO housing to convert to other uses rose 8.4% in 2019 to 90 certificates. Illegal hotel violations rose 3.1% between April of 2019 and March of 2020 as compared to the same period of the prior year, with a total of 3,335 violations. In addition, 11.5% of all rental housing is considered overcrowded, and the citywide vacancy rate was 3.63% in 2017. As this pie chart illustrates, about 2/3 of New York City's occupied housing stock is renter occupied. The largest share is private, non-regulated rentals at 43%, followed by pre-war stabilized at 32%, post-war stabilized 13%, other regulated units at 12%, and rent-controlled units 1%. Examining the number of building permits issued annually helps to determine the amount of new housing planned each year. Permit approvals for new housing units in 2019 increased by 27.0% to 26,547, following a 5.5% decrease in the prior year. In 2019, permits rose in every borough, rising by the most in Manhattan, which rose by 53.8% to 5,512 units. The Bronx also saw an increase in permits, up 49.8% to 5,541 units, while permits in Brooklyn rose 14.8% to 9,696 permits. Permits in Queens rose by 12.2% to 5,137 units, and permits rose in Staten Island by 9.1% to 661 units. First quarter 2020 permits decreased by 10.8% in comparison to the number of permits issued during the first quarter of 2019, including decreases in all but one borough, including Staten Island down 70.3%, Manhattan down 36.0%, Brooklyn down 24.2%, and the Bronx down 7.9%. But permits issued did increase in Queens during the first quarter of 2020, up 21.3%. Looking at the individual months of the first quarter of 2020, just over 2/3 of permits were issued during January, while just 11% were issued during March. Recently released data from April of 2020 shows a 75.6% decrease in permits as compared to the same month of the prior year. You can see from this graph that residential building permits increased 27.0% in 2019, following a decrease in 2018. While the city overall had a 27.0% increase in permits to 26,547 citywide, this map shows the number of permits by borough in 2019 and the change from 2018. As already noted, permits rose in every borough during 2019. Permit data can also be analyzed more deeply by looking at the reported size of the buildings receiving permits. In 2019, a total of 1,394 buildings received permits. Citywide, 37.3% of these buildings were single-family, 34.2% were two-family, 8.8% were 3 or 4 family structures, and 19.8% were buildings with 5 or more units. In 2019, 94.3% of all permits issued citywide were for units in 5-family or greater buildings, a total of 25,033 units, with the average 5-family or greater building containing 46 units for the city as a whole and 92 units in Manhattan, both increases from the prior year. As the graph on this page illustrates, almost all building permits in Manhattan were for the largest buildings, while in Staten Island, virtually all permits were for either 1 or 2-family buildings. Building size was more evenly distributed in Queens. Another way of measuring the level of housing creation is to look at the number of housing units actually completed in a given year, which in 2019 decreased for the first time in 7 years. In 2019, there were 26,599 new housing completions citywide, a 6.9% decrease over the prior year. The only borough to see an increase in completions was Brooklyn, which rose by 8.3%, while the other boroughs fell between 7.3% and 25.3%. As you can see in this graph, the number of apartment units newly receiving final certification of 421A benefits in 2019 decreased, following 2 years of increase. 3/4 of these units are in Brooklyn and Queens, with units decreasing in every borough but Queens, which rose 34%. The other boroughs saw the number of units fall between 14% and 100%. More than 40% of New York City's owner-occupied housing is in the form of co-ops and condos. Construction of new co-ops and condos, which increase the supply of owner-occupied housing, and the conversion of rental housing to co-op or condo status, which reduces the supply of rental housing, have to be accepted by the Attorney General's office. The number of co-op and condo plans filed in 2019 with the Attorney General decreased 2.1%, with a total of 281 plans containing 6,583 residential units, a 22.6% decrease in units. The green bars on this graph represent the proportion of accepted units that are condos, and the bronze bars are accepted co-op units. In 2019, almost all accepted units were condos. In 2019, more than 81% of the residential units were new construction, with the greatest number of units, 43%, in Brooklyn. This chart shows the fluctuation in the number of housing units newly receiving J51 benefits since 1997. As you can see, levels decreased 54.8% in 2019. Not shown here, the decrease in the number of rental units, 27.3%, was less than that of owner units, 68.2%. So in conclusion, the number of building permits increased by 27.0% in 2019 to 26,547 units, but decreased by 10.8% in the first quarter of 2020 and by 75.6% in April of 2020, the most recently available data. While housing units completed decreased by 6.9% to 26,599 units. In addition, 22.6% fewer residential units were approved for co-ops and condos. 19.6% fewer units were certified with 421A tax incentives, while 54.8% fewer units were rehabilitated with J51 tax incentives. There was also an increase in both certificates of no harassment of 10.8% and illegal hotel violations of 3.1%. And demolitions increased just slightly, rising by 0.3%. And the vacancy rate was 3.63%, less than the 5% legal threshold required for the continuation of rent stabilization. Thank you, and if you have any questions, take them now.
Danielle, I just had one question. I didn't pick up on this earlier, but when we look at the decreases in new housing permits, it's down overall by 10.8%, but it's down so dramatically in Manhattan and Brooklyn, 36%, 24%. Was the 21% increase in Queens really so massive in terms of absolute numbers that it just overwhelmed those two decreases?
I can give you the actual numbers if you want. You're talking about just first quarter?
Yeah.
Sure, hang on one second. So in the first quarter, Queens went from 2010 permits to 2,439 units.
Mhm.
But for instance, in Manhattan, which went down 36%, it went from 1,037 units to 664 units.
Okay.
And Staten Island had the biggest decrease, but it was not that much in terms of the actual units,
Okay.
because there's fewer there to start with.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very
Yeah,
much.
I have a quick question. I mean, it's like, is there any explanation as to why there's been a decrease in new units certified for the tax abatements?
Well, for 421A, the basic issue is that a lot of the increase that we saw in the past couple of years was mostly due to an issue where buildings were getting their final certifications and they were not registering as rent stabilized with DHCR for the units that were rentals. That's a requirement of the 421A program. So there was a program put in place where they would lose their certification and their tax benefits if they did not register with DHCR. So that process in the past few years has been the main increase in why the rental units have gone up. And what you're seeing now is not necessarily a decrease in actual new units being certified. I don't have the exact numbers, but there very well could have been an increase in actual new units being certified. But the decrease is because more units are catching up with DHCR.
All right, thank you, Daniel.
Any other questions?
Quick question. So the decrease in completions in 2019, to what extent does that just reflect the decrease in permits the previous year?
It's more like a few years. There's a lag time of at least a few years between that. And the process of coming up with the number of completions, which is done by city planning, it's not an exact science. They go through certificates of occupancy, and not every building has every unit that comes online in the same year. So sometimes you might have a building that has a lot of units, but they're not all ready for occupancy. And it doesn't match up exactly with the permits for many reasons. But it would be usually at least 3 years between a permit and the completion, depending on the size of the building.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, so Andrew, should we move on to the next report?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, if there aren't any more questions about housing supply, certainly.
Okay, I guess it's, I'm up next. I'm going to do the presentation. Let me bring it up for the screen to share. Can everyone see the presentation slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good morning. I'll present the changes to the rent stabilized housing stock in New York City in 2019 report. Oops. Rent regulation has been a fixture in New York City's housing market for over 75 years, although the laws that govern rent-regulated housing have been substantially changed and modified over time, including most recently with passage of the Housing Stability and Rent and Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which went into effect last June. It eliminated some of the ways that apartments could be deregulated, among other changes. In addition to legislative changes, the existing laws allow for dynamic changes in the regulatory status of a unit, of a significant portion of the rent-regulated housing stock in any given year. Units enter, exit, or change status within the regulatory system. This report is our annual update of changes to the rent-stabilized housing stock in New York City. These totals do not represent every unit that has been added or subtracted from the stabilized stock, but rather those that have been recorded or registered by various city and state agencies. Therefore, they represent a floor or minimum count of the actual number of newly regulated and deregulated units in these years. Since newly constructed or substantially rehabilitated units are exempt from rent regulation, increases to the regulated housing stock are often the result of owners placing these new units under stabilization in exchange for tax benefits. Events that lead to the addition of stabilized units include the following. Section 421A tax exemption program, the J51 property tax exemption and abatement program, Articles 11, 14, and 15 of the Private Housing Finance Law, PHFL programs, Mitchell-Lama buyouts, lofts converted to stabilized units, rent control departments converting to rent stabilization, as well as other forms of additions. Tax exemption and abatement programs have a significant impact on the inventory of stabilized housing. Apartments newly created with the aid of these programs must typically remain rent stabilized for the duration of their benefits. In 2019, an estimated total of 5,723 units were added to the rent stabilized stock through the 421A program. That was 39% fewer than in the prior year. The largest number of these units was in Brooklyn, 64%, followed by Manhattan with 22%, Queens with 10%, the Bronx 5%, and Staten Island had fewer than 1%. According to HCR, the median legal rent of all currently registered rent stabilized apartments receiving 421A tax abatements in 2019 was $3,411, a 2% increase over the prior year. In 2019, 196 units were added to the stabilized stock through the J51 program. That was a 37% decline from the prior year. Other additions to the stabilized stock in 2019 include 353 Mitchell-Lama rental units, which became rent stabilized, compared to none in 2018. Lofts converted to stabilized status added 22 units, down from 43 the prior year. 361 units were decontrolled and became rent stabilized in 2019, up from 141 in the prior year. And additions to the stabilized stock through tax incentive programs under Articles 11, 14, and 15 of the Private Housing Finance Law added a total of 2,164 units, 14% more than the prior year. Among these tax incentive programs, the largest number of units were in Manhattan with a full half of them, 50%, followed by the Bronx with 47%, and Brooklyn with 4%. There were none in Queens or Staten Island. So summing up all the additions, there were 8,819 units added to the stabilized housing stock in 2019. That was 26% fewer than in the prior year. Of these initially registered rent stabilized apartments, the median legal registered rent was $4,798. That was 60% higher than in the prior year.
Brian, can I ask you a question about that last slide?
Sure.
So if the median was at $4,800, how many would we put into like the affordable category of, I don't know, less than $1,500? Like, do we know how many were, what percentage were kind of in that $1,500 to $2,000 or less?
We don't have that. We just have the median figure. We get this from DHCR. They just give that. I'm not sure if they can analyze it that much. I mean, typically they can't from similar requests in the past. So,
okay, thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't have that.
David, remember these are 421A units,
Yes.
and they tend to be close to market anyway.
So we could kind of assume then that almost all these units are market.
Yeah, the 421A, the other ones that come online would have, no, actually, are these 421A, Brian, or all units?
These are all
No,
units.
all units. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I misspoke.
But 421A would have set asides, for at least some of the buildings.
Yeah,
I was,
sorry
I
about
was
that.
just gonna say that in the 421As, almost all the new ones have to have a certain percentage of, below market affordable units.
It should be about 20% of the 421As.
Danielle, you're saying that that's 20% are the below markets.
Should be about 20% below market, but I guess it depends. sometimes they market it to different people. There's different affordable ranges. Some of them that are quote unquote affordable, they might be marketed to people making 130% of the median income. So there's a range. There's some that are probably $800 a month and some that are affordable that are $2,000 a month.
Okay.
And then the rest of them, you're getting the, market rate basically.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll continue then. If there are any more questions, we'll have time at the end as well. I'll move on to subtractions now from rent stabilization. Deregulation of stabilized units occur because of statutory requirements or because of physical changes to the residential dwellings. Events that have led to the removal of stabilized units include high rent, high income deregulation, high rent vacancy deregulation, co-op and condo conversions, expiration of 421A and J51 benefits, substantial rehabilitation, conversion to commercial or professional status, as well as other losses to the housing stock, such as demolitions, condemnations, and apartment mergers. With passage of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which went into effect last June, occupied apartments may no longer be deregulated. However, prior to that date, one type of deregulation that was allowed was high rent, high income deregulation. Last year, it resulted in 160 apartments removed from rent regulation, 47% more than in the prior year. Of these units, almost half, 49% were in Manhattan, 39% were in Brooklyn, 10% in Queens, 2% in the Bronx, and there were none on Staten Island. This graph shows the number of units each year that left the stabilized housing stock due to high rent, high income deregulation since 1994, when it was first permitted. Over this period, at least 6,615 units have been removed due to this type of deregulation. The largest number of subtractions from the stabilized housing stock were due to high rent vacancy deregulation, which was also abolished with passage of the new rent laws last June. 7,878 units were deregulated in 2019 due to high rent vacancy deregulation, which was a 70% increase from the prior year. Of these units, 61% were in Manhattan, 21% in Brooklyn, 14% in Queens, 4% in the Bronx, and 1% on Staten Island. This graph shows the minimum number of units that have left the stabilized stock over the past 26 years since state law first permitted deregulation of vacant units with high rents in 1994. It illustrates the increase that occurred in most years through 2009, the year the largest number of units left stabilization due to high rent vacancy deregulation. Since that peak, the number of deregulations has fluctuated a good deal. Collectively, at least 168,170 units were registered with DHCR as being deregulated due to high rent vacancy deregulation since 1994. Apartments left stabilization for other reasons. Co-op condo status conversions, which include both newly converted units as well as stabilized tenants vacating apartments in previously converted buildings, totaled 600 units, 24% fewer than in the prior year. Expiration of 421A benefits resulted in a total of 892 units removed from stabilization, 12% fewer than the prior year. The expiration of J51 benefits resulted in a total of 423 units removed, 13% more than in the prior year. 260 units were removed from stabilization through substantial rehabilitation, 24% more than the prior year. 12 units were converted to non-residential use compared to 7 the prior year. And in the largest category on this page, other losses to the stabilized housing stock, such as merger of pre-existing units or demolition, resulted in 1,083 additional units leaving the stabilized housing stock, 212% more than in the prior year. So summing up all the subtractions, at least 11,263 units left stabilization in 2019, 51% more than in the prior year. By borough, 62% of all units leaving stabilization were in Manhattan. Next was Brooklyn with 21%, followed by Queens with 12%, Bronx with 4%, and Staten Island representing fewer than 1% of units removed from stabilization last year. This table shows the total number of additions and subtractions from all the programs in 2019. It includes the 8,819 additions to the stabilized stock and 11,263 units removed from stabilization. The difference between the two results in an estimated net decrease of the stabilized housing stock of 2,444 units last year. Like I said, there were at least 2,444 units removed. In some, once you factor in the additions last year, most additions to the stabilized stock were the result of the 421A tax incentive program, representing almost 2/3, 65% of the additions. Meanwhile, high rent vacancy deregulation was the largest source of measured subtractions from the stabilized housing stock, accounting for 70% of the total number of subtractions. This graph shows the estimated annual change in the total number of stabilized units since 2003, when the RGB first examined this data in an annual report. Since 2003, except for 2 years, net losses have occurred each year, with as many as 15,465 units lost in 2009. So summing up the changes since 1994, the RGB has counted 164,377 additions to the stabilized stock and at least 309,689 apartments removed from the stabilized stock, resulting in New York City experiencing a cumulative net loss of at least 145,312 stabilized housing units over the last 26 years. Thank you. I will now take any additional questions you may have.
I just wanted to chime in a little bit. You know, sometimes I get questions of how many units we impact with our special guideline that we do every year, the units that are going from rent control to rent stabilization. So this report helps us to track those. So just to put that in perspective, about 361 units went from rent control to rent stabilization last year. So that is a total number of units that guideline would impact. So I do get that question on occasion. So we update that number. With deregulation not possible anymore for rent control units, I would imagine that number to start to tick up, but there is only about 20,000 rent control units left in the city. So.
Andrew, can you explain a little bit more on what causes a unit that's rent controlled to be deregulated and become rent stabilized? Is it various issues, higher rents, vacancies, and all of that? How does that act? Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. When a unit that's rent controlled becomes vacant, then it goes into rent stabilization. Back when rent stabilization first started in 1969, most units were rent controlled. There was, I think, about 1 million rent control units or so. And when those rent control units became vacant, they would go into rent stabilization. So there was a lot of turnover, and by 1980, a large majority of rent control units had become rent stabilized. So there's still part of the law that allows for that. So when a unit becomes rent control becomes vacant, it goes into rent stabilization. So part of that is a special guideline that we're required to do. But there are other ways owners can establish that initial rent. I know particular one way is if they can look at comparable rents in the unit that are in the same line. So you may have a unit that's 2A, 3A, 4A. So each floor they would have the same type of unit, and they could take an average of those rents, and that could be the initial rent. So there are other ways that the new rent could be calculated beyond our special guideline. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question that's been submitted to me by a tenant who's watching. They would like clarification on the number of units DHCR reports as lost, that this includes only those units that landlords voluntarily report as deregulated. This ended in June 2019, but they wanted that to be clarified. And to make the point that no one knows how many units were actually illegally deregulated and not registered with ORA. But we know that it was a lot.
I object to that. You know that a lot of apartments were illegally deregulated. That's an outrageous statement. I'm sorry. There's no fact behind that.
Part of the purpose of the rent laws was to provide protection because there have been rampant abuses for decades. And that was the entire purpose of the new rent reform laws. And if there weren't rampant abuses, then we likely would not have had that. The other thing is that, we often have had these conversations about, sort of like quid pro quo. Because we have the new rent reform laws, then that's why we need X, Y, and Z to protect homeowners, small landlords. But I think that some of the data that we just saw is even more reason why we shouldn't use that analysis. We just heard since the 1990s that over 300,000 stabilized units have been removed. We can't get those back. So that's something that I really want to underscore. And secondly, this is, we're talking about two different things. It's the physical availability of housing. So whether it's actually physically available, because we can't get those units back. And then secondly, even if some housing is available, is it affordable? So it's so many different angles here. So to respond, and I don't want to get into a back and, well, it's fine if we get into a back and forth, but the point is, yes, there have been rampant abuses, which I will state again, and that has been the purpose of the rent reform laws, to curtail a lot of those abuses. And the self-reporting is, again, only something, we can only have the numbers because of people who report. We don't know how many units were deregulated that were not reported. And me as a tenant attorney, we see things all of the time in court where we have to represent tenants, that we see these things going on. So it does happen behind the scenes. It has been rampant. I can speak on it because we represent these people. And I can speak on it because that was the purpose of the rent reform laws.
Andrew, can I ask a clarifying question about this debate? What is kind of our baseline year of rent stabilization? And do we see any drop off in the number of registered units that are not explained by the data that Brian just went over?
Well, let me go back to the first part from the original question. I think the point that was made is that, or the intent of the question was, does this report capture every unit that's been destabilized? And it doesn't. There was a time that owners were not required to register that a unit had become deregulated. So that's why we always use we always call it a floor of units that have been deregulated. So there was a time that they didn't have to do that. And I believe the change, Brian, was it 2000 or 2003 when they were, maybe it was even later than that. I know in 2000 there was
2000. Yeah, let me check. I forgot.
Yeah, so while Brian's checking that, so that's, I think what it's referring, it doesn't mean that the unit was necessarily deregulated illegally. It was simply not registered. There could be some units that are deregulated, illegally as well, but we are not going to capture those either way.
But Andrew, let me just ask.
Do we know how many tenants file a fair market rent appeal every year? Or maybe that's something we can ask DHCR later.
I believe it's something that we ask them in their questions. I think they provide that information, but I'm not sure to fair market rent appeal. I'd have to go back to the questions.
Right, yeah, because that's also.
I know we do overcharges in rent which is different than a fair market rent appeal.
Right, because if we're talking about, deregulation, whether it's legal or illegal, that comes into play, and very few tenants even know about filing that. So again, the numbers that we have are what has, the reports are based on what is self-reported to these city agencies. But the point that I'm making is that if it is based on self-reporting, we don't know what the actual numbers may be, right? And that's not the fault of the city agencies. That's not the fault of people preparing the reports. The point being made is that they can only go off of the information provided to them. But if the information provided to them is just based off of self-reporting, and number one, not everyone may report, and number two, not all tenants will file a fair market rent appeal. So we can't capture everything.
So Andrew, along those lines, so let me try to ask a question. I'm not sure if this is clear, but like, if we knew that there was like 1.5 million units of rent stabilized housing in 1974, I just made up that number. And then Brian's analysis reveals that, whatever, let's say 400,000 were removed from the rent regulated stock. Is there like an unknown tranche of rent stabilized apartments that have disappeared that we don't know about, or we don't even have that original number that we could use as a baseline?
Well, it's tough because it's self-reported. It's owner reported. So if the owner, there's a percentage of units that are not, and I don't know what this number is. That owners should be registering their units, but they're not for whatever reason. So it's hard to get to that number. So say the HVS says there's 960,000 units registered that are stabilized, they count that. DHCR has a number of 870,000 or 890,000 units that are registered each year. Which portion of those either have been lost or just not reporting? And the number of units have been going up recently because 421A, there was 421A units were not being registered when they should have been registered. So there's been a close in that gap between what the official count through the HVS versus what's actually registered. So it's hard to say, but there's probably a certain number of those units that have probably been lost but I can't quantify that number. But there's always been a difference between the number of units registered versus the HVS number.
But why do we trust the HVS number? Why is that the reliable number?
Well, I think they go a lot. It's not simply when they do the HVS methodology for counting units, they try to count every unit, not simply by asking on the survey, but they actually go out and they try to figure out what those units are. They do a pretty thorough count of what they are. But they just don't use owner registration. They use all different types of data to try to get to that number. So there is a difference. They're just not relying on owner reported registrations.
Patty, can I just ask you, do you have any sense of that difference in the two numbers between the HVS and the HCR data, or is that not something you've ever looked at?
It's not something I've ever looked at. I just think that there's many small owners that probably never understood what they were supposed to do or whatever, and they still treat their tenants as stabilized and they still properly give the increases, but they may not understand what they're required to do. So there's always, I think,
it's not an outrageous statement overall.
It is an outrageous statement that apartments were illegally deregulated, and I'm not saying that there aren't some, but
you just said that some small landlords do it and they don't mean to.
Okay, I don't use the characterizations that you're using, saying that there's, a tremendous amount of illegally deregulated apartments, because for the most part, just as you represent tenants, I represent owners, and my clients all deregulate apartments properly. They do the renovations, they have all the documents, and they did it properly. So I don't know what buildings you are referring to, but those are not certainly buildings that I've been associated with.
So just to, I mean, HCR provided us the most current number for 2018 was 885,000 registrations filed by owners. And again, I believe the HVS is about 960,000 units. So there is a difference.
Andrew, I have a quick question. Haven't we talked about in previous years that when properties sell, sometimes there's a delay in someone doing their registration, and that was thought to be one of the reasons in the gap?
I mean, it could be. I think some, you know, I don't want to speculate. I mean, there are different factors that go into why an owner wouldn't register or it wouldn't come up, but they can go back and register those units. HCR will tell us a number every year, and then it's updated the next year, because you can continue to file with the units. There was a big lag in the 421 registrations, 421A registrations, so that's closed the gap. So, but there is a difference between the two numbers. I think it's a little bit of everything we're talking about, why there is a difference.
But do they continue to update for many, many years?
You can go back and, as far as I know, and maybe
5 years later,
correct me on this, but I think you can go back and register those units for that particular year. I don't know if there's a restriction in time to do that. Do you, Brian? I think.
Yeah, you sure? Yeah, you certainly can. And I mean, you know, there've been reports in the past of people doing that. Also, your question earlier about when it was, Andrew, you were wondering about when owners were required to file high rent vacancy deregulations. It wasn't until 2014.
14.
Until then, all the numbers represent, you know, it wasn't required. So.
Do we know what the high point, the most reliable number is for the high point in the number of rent stabilized units in the city? Like what year and what number of units that was? Do we know that information?
We'd have to go back and find that.
Okay, all right. Not that important.
Yeah, curious. I don't know. Maybe it was, yeah, I don't even want to speculate. It was certainly over 1 million. Maybe it was 1.2 million or 1.3 million at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But there's been a shift. I mean, when rent stabilization started, there were more rent control units, a lot more rent control units. So,
right, and they switched to stabilization. But we'd have to go back into HVS's. For some reason, 1.2 sticks out in my mind, but please don't take that as fact. I want to go back and see if I can find that number.
Actually, that would be interesting to know what the most reliable high point number of rent stabilized. But Brian makes a good point. I mean, because like, I guess you want to know rent stabilized. You know, I guess you want to know rent regulated and then rent stabilized as a subset of that. If that's not too hard to figure out.
We can't really do this till we get back in the office because
yeah, no, this is not urgent.
Yeah, it would be
copy books.
Yeah, this is not urgent at all. This is just, I think, for a longer term conversation.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it is. Thank you all for the reports and for all the information. It's definitely important as an overall picture, because again, when we're talking about you know, as this board, as the number of rent regulated units that we're covering, it is important to understand that we are dealing with a lot less units, right? And so we're not, you know, the same units that were available in the 1990s are much less that are available today. And so, you know, granted, the new rent reforms do curtail like high income and high vacancy decontrol. But the point is, a lot of people are, if we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of less units, we also need to make sure that those units are still affordable and within the grasp of people to afford them. Because there's, you know, it's not like these units were going to stay in the system forever, as we saw. So that's the point, you know, I was trying to make earlier, that I think it you know, merits some reflection here when we're making decisions.
Any other comments on this report, on the changes report?
I just have one comment. I think it's important to note that 421A buildings are built with the intention of tenants being stabilized only for a specific period of time during the time period that they're receiving tax benefits. So putting aside the affordable units, which remain rent stabilized after the building, tax benefits expire. When people hear of all these numbers of units leaving rent stabilization, many of those are now in buildings that were 421A that were always meant to leave rent stabilization when the benefits expired. So I just want to clear that up for the newer people on the board so they have some understanding.
So
We don't,
Patty's, I'm just looking at, Brian, I'm looking at your slide, the summary table of additions and subtractions. So I just want to make sure I understand. So Patty's effectively talking about 421 expiration of a loss of 892 units and J51 expiration, a loss of 423 units. Patty, right? That's the ones that you're saying kind of are expected to leave the supply.
Absolutely. That's the way the system was built for those particular units.
Yeah.
I have a
I think we have, I'm sorry, I'll go after Christina.
Yeah, mine's just a question with the 421A rent stabilized apartments. Are those the same apartments that have like the are tied to income with the AMIs, or is that different?
No, that's different. There's affordable units that are rent stabilized, but then there's rent stabilized units that are simply rent stabilized because the building's accepting tax benefits. And those units stay rent stabilized during the tax benefit period. And when the benefits end, those units come out of rent stabilization. That's old 421. Then there's a new 421A program that's a little different.
Those stabilized apartments that have that median rent of 4,000.
Yes, those are the apartments that come out. So those wouldn't help the lower income people anyway. Right. Those are a different set, but that's units that are coming off the stabilization tally.
But they're still stabilized. They just have a higher rent. Okay.
Yes.
That was my question. Thank you. Go ahead, Leah.
So I have 2 points. The first is that overall, whether it's 421A or which are shorter term or longer term, the point is still the same, which is that we are and have effectively lost more and more affordable housing in the city. And then the second is that the majority of the deregulated units are not under 421. I think it was about 150,000 that was quoted by the New York Times that were both income and vacancy deregulated. And so, I think, we don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but the larger point being made is that we are dealing with much less affordable housing that is available in 2020 than was available in 1990. And so we need to make sure, or at the very least, it's important to understand that the minor or moderate or high increases being made do ultimately have an effect on over time how many people will be able to access that amount of housing that's available, that's much less than was available, decades ago.
Any other comments on the changes report? Okay, Andrew, should we move on to assistant?
Yeah, she's here, so we can move on.
So I'd like to welcome HPD's Assistant Commissioner Joffe, and thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me. Okay, if I jump right in?
Please.
Okay. So good morning, Chairman Reese and members of the Rent Guidelines Board. I'm Lucy Jaffe, Assistant Commissioner for Housing Policy for the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. In this capacity, I oversee HPD's research and evaluation team, which conducts the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, NYC HVS. While I'm pleased to join you again to discuss some of HPD's work over the past year, I have to begin by acknowledging the unprecedented circumstances created by the COVID-19 emergency. This is an incomprehensible tragedy that has touched so many New Yorkers, including many people attending this meeting today and many of us. New York City has been at the epicenter of the pandemic, but we are also going to be at the forefront of the recovery. The health and safety of all New Yorkers is HPD's top priority, and secure housing is central to this mission. We are in uncharted territory and facing unforeseen challenges, but we remain focused on the many tenants, homeowners. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties.
While she's looking up, I just wanted to remind the board members that we sent her testimony. So if you want to follow along, you're welcome to do so.
Sorry about that, I'm back. But we remain focused on providing relief to the many tenants, homeowners, and small building owners who are suffering as a result of this crisis. As we begin to get a better sense of the full impact of the pandemic and the corresponding financial and housing challenges, we will also work to ensure the city recovers fairly and equitably. Creating and preserving affordable housing, supporting owners in maintaining safe, high-quality housing, and strengthening renter protections and keeping tenants in their homes will remain top priorities for HPD. As requested by the board, I'll now discuss HPD's work over the past year regarding these crucial issues. Creating and preserving affordable housing. HPD, working in tandem with the New York City Housing Development Corporation, HDC, financed the preservation of 16,180 and the new construction of 9,122 affordable homes in fiscal year 2019. We are working in all 5 boroughs with about 6,000 units in the Bronx, 7,000 units in Brooklyn, 10,000 units in Manhattan, 2,000 units in Queens, and 50 units in Staten Island. The majority of these, more than 50%, serve very low-income households or households earning less than 50% of HUD income limits, which for a family of 3 is equivalent to about $51,000 per year. Since the city has been ahead of schedule with over 160,000 homes financed to date, we remain confident we can meet our goal of creating or preserving 300,000 affordable homes by 2026. It is more important than ever that New Yorkers gain access to affordable housing as quickly as possible. In 2019, the city marketed nearly 6,100 units across more than 250 projects on Housing Connect, our online affordable housing lottery portal. In order to make affordable housing lotteries more accessible to more people, HPD further expanded the Housing Ambassadors program. There are now 48 housing ambassadors, nonprofit partners who assist New Yorkers with the application process. Assistance from ambassadors is available in 20 languages, and there are 3 organizations that specialize in serving applicants with disabilities. Some ambassadors also have access to separate interpretation services, which allow them to serve people in over 200 languages. Finally, Housing Connect 2.0, which will be an entirely revamped system for the affordable housing lottery and will create far greater transparency, efficiency, and accessibility to the process, will launch this summer. HPD and HDC have been working to speed the process wherever possible and to make additional apartments available to homeless New Yorkers in city-financed affordable housing projects that are or will soon be in the marketing process in response to the pandemic. Supporting owners in maintaining safe, high-quality housing. Another top priority is to ensure owners maintain housing that is safe and high quality for all tenants. Through our preservation and tax incentives work, HPD assists building owners in making quality, safety, and environmental efficiency improvements. The city recently launched the Home Fix program, which provides funding, technical assistance, and counseling to owners of 1 to 4 family homes struggling to make needed repairs and otherwise maintain their homes. And as part of Lead-Free NYC, the city launched an ad campaign in November to inform property owners of the grants and resources HPD offers to support lead remediation. Sometimes HPD must take enforcement action against owners who do not comply with their obligations. Every day, hundreds of HPD inspectors visit homes across the city and issue violations to building owners not in compliance. In fiscal year 2019, HPD closed 121,757 emergency heat and hot water complaints and issued 11,481 emergency heat and hot water violations. HPD also issued 13,156 violations for mold and 13,771 violations for either positive or presumed lead-based paint conditions. When necessary, HPD can charge owners for repairs, utilities, and fuel through the Emergency Repair Program, ERP. In fiscal year 2019, ERP charged owners in more than 6,000 buildings. The 250 most distressed multiple dwellings are designated for participation in the Alternative Enforcement Program each year based on the seriousness of the Housing Maintenance Code violations and the amount of emergency repair charges incurred as a result of the work HPD performs. Round 13 buildings were selected on January 31st, 2020. These 250 buildings have more than 41,000 violations and owe more than $1.3 million in municipal arrears. HPD's Housing Litigation Division also brings cases in housing court against owners who do not fix outstanding violations and, when necessary, seeks findings of contempt and incarceration of recalcitrant owners. The city is also committed to eliminating tenant harassment. HPD's anti-harassment unit brings claims against owners in housing court for maintenance-related harassment. As of December 31st, 2019, 819 building-wide inspections were completed in 492 buildings. Of these, the anti-harassment unit has referred 45 buildings for litigation and filed petitions in housing court based on harassment claims in 20. The City Tenant Harassment Task Force, a joint effort by HPD, the Department of Buildings, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the Fire Department, and New York State Homes and Community Renewal, has attempted to inspect over 748 buildings, 13,364 units as of December 31st, 2019. Through 2019, HPD issued over 38,000 violations to these buildings, and 118 of them have ongoing cases in housing court. The city is also using data to identify buildings at risk of harassment, such as through the Certification of No Harassment pilot program launched in September 2018. HPD also works with the newly created Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants to be as comprehensive as possible in our efforts to protect tenants. The city has joined with the other member cities of the High Cost Cities Housing Forum to advocate for federal resources to support tenants, homeowners, and building owners across the 5 boroughs and the country. We need financial assistance for low and moderate income renters and homeowners to prevent eviction and foreclosure, and we need support for building owners who have lost significant rental revenue so they can keep their employees and maintain their buildings to the city's high standards. Strengthening renter protections and keeping tenants in their homes. Housing data in New York City has shown a net rental vacancy rate of less than 5%, which constitutes a state of a housing emergency as defined by state law since the NYC HVS was first conducted in 1965. In 2017, the vacancy rate was 3.63%. The housing shortage is most acute among lower cost units, where we see even lower vacancy rates. Units renting for $1,000 to $1,500 per month had a vacancy rate of only 2.5% in 2017. In 2017, the typical renter paid 34% of their income toward housing, a rate that has been increasing over time. More than half of renter-occupied households were considered rent-burdened because they paid more than 1/3 of their income toward rental costs. And 1/3 of renter-occupied households were severely burdened, meaning they paid more than half of their income toward housing. High rent burden is most acute for low-income households earning up to 80% of HUD income limits, which was $68,700 for a family of 3 in 2017. The rent-stabilized stock overwhelmingly serves these low and moderate income New Yorkers. 86% of those in rent-stabilized units in New York City, more than 830,000 households, fall within the income served by HPD in our affordable housing programs. Looking toward the recovery. Finally, as you all know, HPD conducts the NYC HVS about every 3 years, as we've referenced most recently in 2017. The NYC HVS provides invaluable information on the city's housing stock and its residents, specifically with regard to rent-stabilized units. Data from the NYC HVS are public and used by researchers, policymakers, and housing stakeholders to inform the conversation around housing issues in the city. The next NYC HVS will provide valuable insight on the city's housing stock and residents and serve as a critical tool for understanding the impacts of the pandemic and planning for a fair and equitable recovery. Thank you for this opportunity to update you on HPD's programming and the city's response to the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on housing affordability and stability. We look forward to further collaboration with this board and are available to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. I did have a question. In your testimony, you said we need support for building owners who have lost significant rental revenue so they can keep their employees and maintain their buildings to the city's high standards. What can you say further about that? What do you have in mind? Are there programs in the works to do this?
So the city has a range of tools at its disposal to support owners through our tax incentive programs, through our preservation programs, who are struggling to make ends meet for any reason. We've also joined with other member cities of the High Cost Cities Housing Forum, which I referenced in my testimony, to advocate for federal resources, specifically for emergency building stabilization funds, to target multifamily buildings who've lost significant revenue during this time.
Thank you. Other questions for Assistant Commissioner Jaffe?
I have a question. Could you say a little more about how the city's affordable housing plan is affected by COVID? I know that the capital budget, for example, is being cut back substantially, and how is that going to translate in terms of units? And also, is there going to be a shift, as there was after the last financial crisis 10 years ago, when it was a shift under Bloomberg to more preservation units versus new construction units?
So thank you for that important question. Protecting tenants and keeping people housed remains a top priority for the city right now. And as we all continue to navigate the unique challenges that the COVID-19 emergency has presented, safety and health of all New Yorkers continues to be our top priority. So we're focused on the continuity of our housing work, while obviously protecting staff and our partners and all of the New Yorkers we serve through our many programs. Since the housing plan has been on time and ahead of schedule, with over 160,000 homes financed to date, we do remain confident that we will still meet our goal of 300,000 units by 2026.
In the composition, in terms of preservation versus new construction, you see that as staying the same?
We do remain confident about our ability to meet the goals as we've laid them out. But we're continuously evaluating the needs of the city and as we navigate the pandemic, but we do remain confident in our ability to creatively work with our partners to meet the needs of all New Yorkers.
Thank you.
Any more questions or comments?
Yeah, I just had one question. Sorry, David. So the HVS, it's the 2020 year. Has the pandemic impacted that particular study? Because we are, as a board, we rely heavily on that, as a lot of different folks in the city do. So can you give us an update on the timing of the HVS?
Yeah, we are working full steam ahead with our partners at the Census Bureau on the current survey. Obviously, we are in unprecedented times. So as we do, we are working on all potential contingency plans so that we can be ready for anything that comes our way, but we are full steam ahead.
Great, thanks.
And I do appreciate the shout out to the HVS, because we also think it's very important and critical during this time.
Woohoo!
Any other questions or comments? Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for all your important work.
Thank you. Any new business from board members? Any other topics that people would like to discuss? Okay, so we will reconvene for our public hearings in middle-ish June. I look forward to seeing you all there, and I will ask for a motion to adjourn.
A motion.
And do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you so much, and see you soon. Okay, bye.